Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Depends on where you are. It's a great pleasure for me, on behalf of the Brazilian Center for International Relations Energy Program, to welcome you to this webinar today. We are here to discuss Brazil's context and global role in the energy transition. That's something that we have been studying for a long time. Since 2021, CEBRI, with the Inter-American Development Bank, the Energy Research Office, EPE, the Brazilian entity responsible for planning in the federal government, and the Center for Energy and Environmental Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, implemented this energy transition program. We call it Carbon Neutrality 2050. Scenarios for Brazil energy transition. This was developed during the period of my predecessor, Jorge Camargo, was the responsible for the energy transition group in CEBRI. This program was established to assess the constraints and potential of Brazil in the energy transition and to offer an independent contribution for the formulation of public policies. This is what an institution like CEBRI must do. And the idea was to see what we could do in order to have policies geared towards Brazil net zero by 2000. So after a series of events, it resulted in 3 scenarios, which will be presented today by the speakers that will follow me. This webinar brings together 4 institutions involved in the program's governance and some international experts from different agencies and institutions to show an international perspective on Brazil energy transition outlook and what we can contribute internationally. I would like to thank Morgan, Giovanni, Rafaela, Professor Esclor, Brent, Thales, and my old friend Jeremy Martin for their participation, as well as the program's sponsors. We have Engie, Equinor, Neoenergia, Shell, and Siemens Energy that have been supporting the institution for a long time. Again, thanks very much for their support. For those who are watching, we appreciate your participation. Hope you enjoy what we will listen today. Now it's time to pass the floor to Morgan, the IDB representative in Brazil, for his opening remarks. And I remember that IDB has been an important partner of CEBRI in this program, and we take this opportunity to once again thank them for their involvement and support in this initiative. Morgan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Decio. Good morning to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I would also like to thank Rafaela, who's been absolutely critical to the success of this project, a senior fellow there at CEBRI. Giovanni Machado as well from EPE, an important partner throughout this process, and Professor Ciclo from COPE, UF, EGJ from the Federal University there in Rio. So I'd like to thank all the other panelists who've agreed to join us today. I think this is a really important and timely discussion that we're going to have today, and the presentation that will be provided that distills indeed quite a bit of effort over several months that focused on the energy transition scenarios in Brazil has been very participatory in its approach and very robust, and has led to the development of models using COPE's very substantial modeling capacities to lay out some of the different scenarios that are likely going forward. So we think it's a really innovative and important contribution to the discussion for the transition here in Brazil. For us, from the perspective of the Inter-American Development Bank, what we aspire to do with our partners here in Brazil and more broadly across Latin America is to help deliver on the ambitions, the climate ambitions under the Paris Agreement, for them to develop strategies, policies, and specific steps to allow the economies to decarbonize, and to do so in a way which makes sense for each country. And to that end, we provide technical and financial cooperation and to help both on the knowledge side, but particularly also on the investment side. So for us, it's a real pleasure to participate in it. In the case of Brazil, clearly, there's huge opportunities. Brazil is already a leading country in terms of its positioning vis-a-vis the use of renewable energies. It also has a very unique ability to exploit its really phenomenal potential sources of energy on renewable side, both solar and wind, but many others that are discussed in much greater detail in the report. And to become truly a leader, a global leader in bioenergy. And indeed, already in transport, Brazil is way ahead of the curve, but there's, as laid out in the report, there's incredible opportunities in terms of advanced biofuels to be taken advantage of. All of this is sort of leads us to the discussion of what next. And I think the report does a very nice job of laying out different policy decisions that are before the government and the various private sector players in terms of how to capitalize on this. Clearly, there's a need to invest in capacity building, in institutional, legal, and regulatory frameworks, but I think there's a real sort of sense of purpose here, and a recognition of the incredible opportunity that's afforded by Brazil's unique positioning. So, for us to be able to contribute to this with CEBRI, with EPE, with the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro has been a real pleasure. So I hope that the discussion is rich, and that out of this we have yet another sort of alignment with regard to of the objectives. But we're very pleased to have taken part, and it's been a real pleasure to work with CEBRI throughout this process. So thanks again, and I will pass the word to our partner and a real technical leader in this field, so to Giovanni. Thanks so much, Giovanni. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First, I would like to thank CEBRI for the partnership in this project, and also for organizing these events, and also I'd like to thank IDB for believing in this energy transition program from the beginning, as well as Synergia for joining us in the project to elaborate the scenarios and sensibilities analysis. Well, EPE was very enthusiastic about the program right away, and the program is unique. It goes to beyond elaborating scenarios by one institution to engage multiple stakeholders in the process to build consensus. So it's a sample of real life of decision makers and policymakers in the energy transition, exploring divergence and convergence under uncertainties to design well-informed strategies, to engage stakeholders and to take decisions. Of course, the program has a complex challenge and innovative governance, but we made it together anyway. Findings, as we will see, have brought a lot of food for thoughts and a sound base to take decisions. All of you will see in the next presentation and discussions. Now, Brazil has scenarios to explore pathways to validate the consistency of its NDC. Yes, Brazil can and will reach net zero in 2050. Moreover, the program has assessed different pathways to deal with uncertainties through 2050 horizon. One could prefer a particular scenario's case or another or other sensibilities. But in any case, Brazil has a target, net zero in 2050. It can be north, can be northeast or northwest. It doesn't matter. The destiny of our journey is the direction of north, not east, not west or south. Net zero in 2050 is a north to Brazil. So the energy transition program will be a basis for the new studies and long-term planning for EPE for sure. To conclude, it's important to bear in mind that we have already identified real business case for all assumptions of the scenarios presented in the energy transition program. Furthermore, EPE, IDB, and CEBRI, as well as Synergia, are planning to have other events to showcase those real business cases that are in harmony with the scenarios assumptions of the energy transition program. It's not only possible, but we are also on the way. So that's all by now. Thank you again for attention and time. Thanks for CEBRI by the invitation and all others involved in the project, and also the colleagues in this panel. Back to my colleague, very close friend, Rafaela Guedes, Senior Fellow at CEBRI, to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you, Morgan, Décio. And we will be here talking and interacting with all of you, also with Alexandre Sklo, with Thales, and with Brent that I will present in a moment. So, and thank you to the audience. I saw here that it's growing, and this is very, very exciting for us, because the main idea that we had when we created this program, I think that Morgan started talking about sense of purpose, and everybody that was involved, more than anything, had a sense of purpose in terms of bringing the correct discussions here to Brazil, making it cost effective, really paying attention so that it can be embedded in it. You can talk about climate justice, a just energy transition, something that is sustainable for Brazil. So what is important in terms of our perspectives here from Brazil, and how could we make this happen, creating the bridges, creating the good conversation. And even if we had different thoughts, and there were times where we had different ideas, so how can we understand these different ideas? And then we went to copy, we went to Synergia, and let's do the math, let's see the models and see what comes around with it. And there are two things that I would like to highlight, which were very important, and Alexandre Sklo will present this to us. In the case of Brazil, especially when we talk about Brazil's energy transition, it's important to bear in mind that as a necessary condition, we must stop illegal deforestation. Without that, the energy sector and other sectors can do lots of things that it will not be effective for Brazil. And the second thing that was very clear in our scenarios was the importance of biofuels. And I'm not talking just about ethanol or biodiesel, but the advanced biofuels. And then we can talk about biojet, biobunker, and the importance of CCS. So there's a lot of development that must come along. There's a lot of technical achievements that we must bring to Brazil, and talking about this and interacting, we can make the right decisions so that it's cost effective. And if we have good costs for Brazil, we can make this more just and more feasible, and in order to have everybody as part of this energy solutions that will come along. So thank you very much. With that, I will pass to Alexandre Sklo so that he can give like a 10-15 minutes, and then we will start our interaction, listening to Brent Warner, that comes from the agency, the international agency, Thales from the Economic Forum, World Economic Forum, and Jeremy from the Institute of America. Thank you very much, and over to you, Sklo.
Thank you, Rafaela, for this invitation and for giving me more five minutes. Time is so scarce for this presentation. It's a very dense presentation, so I will start with the presentation right now.
15, you have 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah. But I'm looking for, yeah, I'm sharing the screen now. Thank you. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so let's start. So just talking about what we did here. We had 3 steps in this project. This is the 3rd step related to the scenarios and the modeling. And just to have a brief understand about our modeling resources in the lab, we have some sectoral models in the lab, but also we have different integrated assessment models that provide the nexus between land use, materials, water, and energy. So we are able to forecast not only the emissions from conditions, from field conditions, but also emissions from land use change, emissions from industrial processes, but also offsets. For example, mitigation coming from nature-based solutions. So these are the type of models that we have in our lab. We have some, I'll use the pointer here. We have some sectoral models for typical energy sectors, but we have these integrated assessment models. These are global integrated assessment models, one CGE model and another partial equilibrium model. These global models provide information and constraints to the national model, the Brazilian model, which is also an energy and land use system model. In this work, we used the coffee model, the global coffee model. This is one of the 4 global IAMs that were selected in the last IPCC report to provide these illustrative mitigation pathways. One of the illustrative mitigation pathways in this report came from the coffee model. This is a global model with 18 regions. Brazil is one of the regions, and by having this simulation, we are able to, for example, forecast oil prices, oil products prices, trade of food, trade of energy, and then we can provide the constraints for the Brazilian national equilibrium model, which is the BLUES model. We have run the BLUES model, but also we have run the COF model to provide information for the BLUES model in one of the scenarios. So we have run 3 scenarios. One scenario is the Brazilian ambition, the Brazilian announced ambition for the carbon neutrality in 2050. This is a neutrality related to net GHG emissions. And this is very important to Brazil because, as I will show after, Brazil has a very important non-CO2 emissions compared to the world. So in order to be GHG net in Brazil, this means that we have to be net also in non-CO2 gases. This scenario, alternative transition, is one scenario that was somehow constrained by some technological pathways. So this scenario is more freely run, and this scenario was provided by the 1st and the 2nd step of the project. We have here, for example, some constraints related to more electricity in mobility, constrained CCS, a little bit more nuclear power. So this is a kind of alternative transition that is not the least cost situation for Brazil, but is Brazil following somehow some of the international technological decisions or pathways. And these 3rd scenarios, the global transition, we have here, we have run the Brazilian global model, the global model, our integrated assessment global model, in order to have the Brazilian CO2 budget. So we have the temperature target of 1.5 degrees in 2100. Then we run our global model with a CO2 budget for the world. And then we can see the Brazilian contribution for this global carbon budget. Going to the results, I will have to be fast here, sorry for that, but we have the time after to discuss the results. These are the primary energy consumption results in 2050. We have the picture of 2050. As you can see, in the case of the 3 scenarios compared to the business as usual, we have more renewables, we have more biofuels. In the case of the alternative transition, because of the electricity in industrial sector and in the transportation sector, we need more wind power and a little bit more solar power in order to supply the electricity that is bigger here, that is more consumed in this scenario compared to the other two scenarios. The scenario related to the Brazilian ambition announced in COP26 and the scenario related to the global transition are quite the same in terms of the primary energy consumption, but they have some difference that I will show later. One thing here to say that Brazil has a lot of emissions coming from land use and agriculture, and this relates to what Rafaela told us before. It's impossible to the model. It's always possible in a mathematical model to find solution, but a real solution is impossible in the mathematical model if we cannot stop illegal deforestation in Brazil. This emission related to illegal deforestation and the impacts of illegal deforestation in terms of the Brazilian carbon budget means that we cannot find solutions, some real and feasible solutions in terms of the Brazilian ambitions related to the mitigation. This is an important feature that it is a result of our model. It's quite logical, but we have to show that. Another thing that is important to say, here we have the Brazilian ambition to be net zero in terms of GHG in 2050. But since non-CO2 gases are very important in the case of Brazil, in order to be net zero in 2050, the model shows that we need to be net CO2 zero in terms of 1 decade before, 10 years before, quite 10 years before. In terms of power generation, the second scenario, we have more electricity consumption than the other two scenarios. And I told you before, this comes from the electricity in mobility, more electric cars, but also more electric buses, more electric trucks, small trucks, and also more electricity in the industrial sector. So in this scenario, electricity consumption is higher than in the other scenarios, but it's important to show that we have more electricity coming from biomass with CCS in the end of the period. We have more wind, we have more solar PV in the three scenarios. So we have a huge expansion of renewables, but these expansions not based on the hydropower, as is the usual profile in the Brazilian electricity matrix, but it's based on wind, more on wind, but also in PV and biomass. And in the case of biomass, in the end of the period, equipped with CCS. In terms of oil, in this first scenario, in the third scenario, Brazil stays as a bigger oil supplier. It's less than the official forecast in Brazil, but is higher than these forecasts, for example, in the IEA net zero scenario. And this came from the fact that Brazil has crudes that have, well, I say, a triple resilience. We have crudes in the frontiers, mostly in the pre-salt frontiers, that have a lower cost. This means a higher productivity, lower carbon footprints, and a high quality crude oil. This means that we are producing oil and supplying oil that are medium and light and not sour. And these are the best oils for the remaining refining in the long term that will be run for diesel, jet fuel, bunker, and petrochemicals. And that explains why the model chooses this type of production. We are producing oil and we are exporting oil, replacing some heavy crudes that will be stranded in the world trade of oil. In the case of biofuel, up to 2040, we have the same type of evolution with a small penetration of cellulosic fuels and some advanced fuels based on seeds and fats here. And in 2050, this changed a lot because of the penetration of green and co-processed diesel. These co-processed diesel come from vegetable oil, fats, and cellulosic biomass in oil refineries here. And then we have these cellulosic fuels co-producing diesel, naphtha, bunker, and jet fuels. So these are the kind of biorefinery needed for the Brazilian transportation sector, but also in the case of the petrochemicals, this is also important too, as well. It's important to say also that in the first and the third scenario, we need some biofuels with CCS. So this production in the case of the first and the third scenario comes also equipped with CCS. The same for the ethanol production here as well. In this second scenario, we don't have CCS as a constraint for the model, but we stays needing the cellulosic fuel. It's important to say that it's worth saying that diesel is very important for the Brazilian energy matrix. In the case of hydrogen, we have a huge increase of the hydrogen consumption in Brazil, but only in the second scenario, and this is a constraint for the second scenario, hydrogen is produced for exports. So we have the hydrogen carrier coming from electrolysis for export, around 4 million tons of hydrogen. But in the other scenarios, the least cost solution is not to export the hydrogen, but to use it to produce, to adjust the carbon hydrogen ratio of these cellulosic and fat fuels for these advanced fuels. The transportation sector we have here, and the more important message here is when we have the electricity in mobility, the final energy consumption, as expected, is smaller. But it's important to say this electricity consumption here is not only coming, is not deriving only from BEVs, from battery electric vehicles, but also from fuel cell electric vehicles. And in the case of the 2050 results for the 3 scenarios, we start to see some fuel cell vehicles using ethanol. So part of the ethanol, a fraction of the ethanol that was used in the light duty vehicles, it will be used in fuel cell vehicles. In the case of the industry, and I am ending the presentation now, this I think is the last slide with some content of the result. In the case of the industry, we see that Brazil, this is a hard situation for Brazil because cement and iron, steel and petrochemicals are the most important industrial sector in Brazil. But there are some important results here as well. So the natural gas starts to replace oil and a part of the coal in the iron and steel sector. And a very important result too is the fact that we start to see at the end from 2040 onwards, we start to see some biomaterials being produced in the petrochemical sector. Part of that comes from ethanol. Brazil has already an ethylene plant by processing the ethanol, but part of it comes also from the bio-naphtha that was co-produced with diesel, green diesel and green jet fuel in terms of liquid fuel production. And in the presentation, by having these results, it's important to say that these are some pathways, these are scenarios, this is what if results. And by having this scenario, you can see that Brazil has a lot of existing competitive advantage, but also some challenges. Brazil has to deal with a huge consumption of liquid fuels, particularly the diesel for long distance trucks, for urban buses. And also Brazil has to deal with the fact that Brazil has a lot of possibilities in terms of biofuel renewables and has to understand what to do with the oil and gas supply in frontier areas. Our study shows that part of this can be produced if it replaces other production in the world because of the high quality of the crudes in Brazil. Brazil has to stop, has to eliminate illegal deforestation. This is a condition, and this is very important as well in terms of adaptation for the mesoclimate in the South America continent because of the importance of water for energy production in Brazil, for crop production in Brazil, for bioenergy production in Brazil. So illegal deforestation means emission, but also means impact in terms of the energy and food production in Brazil. We have to have a just transition, and we have to focus in some R&D in Brazil. Particularly important is the case of BECCS, the case of cellulosic fuels, but also the importance of producing low carbon hydrogen. And this is not only the so-called green hydrogen, but also hydrogen from biomethane, for example. We can produce biomethane from vinasse in terms of the ethanol industry, and then we can use this biomethane to produce more hydrogen. So we have different sources of hydrogen, and we are going to need this hydrogen, particularly for the production of the advanced biofuels. So I think I can end here, and thank you again.
Flo, you were surprisingly excellent in terms of giving the big messages and doing it in a really short time. So thank you so much. With that, I will then present Brent Warner, which is head of power sector unit in the International Energy Agency. Thales Panza, which is the head of business engagement in Latin America, and Jeremy, vice president of energy and sustainability Institute of America. Brent, I was reading like 1 week ago, you just released, the agency just released the World Energy Investment Report, and it was $2.8 trillion. Of these $2.8 trillion, 1.7 trillion is expected to go to clean energy technologies. And I would love to hear from the agency, understand, because I really believe there is a lot of things to be done in Brazil, a lot of good investments. Alexandre just showed us the importance of BECCS, of CCS developments, of hydrogen developments. There is plenty of good investments to be done, and it would be lovely to hear from the agency and what you have to tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Rafaela. Thank you very much. And thank you to CEBRI and colleagues for the invitation to participate today, and congratulations on the report itself. So again, my name is Brent Warner. I'm the head of the power sector unit for the World Energy Outlook team here at the International Energy Agency. So that means day to day, I'm responsible for the long-term electricity outlook. So everything renewables, nuclear power, and coal-fired power, gas-fired power, how we generate our electricity. So I've been very close to our net zero roadmaps, including our global roadmap and work in the past. As the International Energy Agency, we're an all fuels, all technologies organization, and we work with governments and industry and investors and citizens also around the world in the aim to support secure and affordable energy transitions. So on that front, we welcome very much the analysis on Brazil achieving its carbon neutrality goal. And it's very critical to turn targets into plans and into a strategy of how to move forward. So developing those clear, comprehensive pathways and addressing all of the questions, certainly for the energy sector, which is such a heart of the transitions that we need. And that's worth, I think that would be kind of one of my keywords today would be on momentum. Rafaela, you mentioned this on the clean energy investment side. So it's been scaling up, and we estimate in 2023 that worldwide we'll invest 1.7 trillion in clean energy technologies around the world. That's one sign of investment, or of momentum. Another is that there are more than 70 countries now worldwide with a net zero target. And that covers 3/4 of the global economy and all energy use and emissions. And that is certainly a much higher number than just a few years ago. So we shouldn't underestimate how quickly that momentum has grown. And it's turning those commitments and those plans, those targets into plans and working through all the details. It's really critical. In our own work in the World Energy Outlook, we have 2 pathways that achieve carbon neutrality, particularly in Brazil, but more broadly, our announced pledges scenario and our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And these are two ways forward. One, the announced pledges scenario gives us this pathway that achieves all of those targets that have been put forward. But we see when we put those all together is not necessarily fast enough to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. And that's where the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario is additional ambition that we would need to collectively cut emissions fast enough. So certainly in our analysis, we see many common elements for Brazil with CEBRI's analysis in this report. Clearly, the shift away from fossil fuels is absolutely essential from unabated fossil fuels. And that means that, moving, this is when we get into the sector side, that means transport, pursuing all the opportunities there. Industry, very difficult to tackle, but we need to cut emissions as much as possible. And then, of course, expanding the supply of clean electricity is very essential. So Brazil here is very far ahead of the curve with a very highly decarbonized power mix. And so the challenge is going forward is to keep scaling up the low emission sources like wind and solar PV to keep up with demand growth. And that's both to meet new electricity demand that's from the traditional side, but also emerging needs like electric vehicles, also the hydrogen production side. I think on the oil production side, it was raised by Alexander that this is a changing picture and very much depends on what happens around the world. And then if the world moves on a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, the total use of oil can be cut quite dramatically. And we see and it would certainly be a reshuffling of that oil supply picture in the long term. Just a few words on global context, and then I would end there. I think a key thing we see is that there's a new energy economy emerging worldwide with the transitions that are underway and in the process. To achieve carbon neutrality means accelerating transitions in all sectors, from the power sector to industry, to transport, to everything. And we need quite a lot of innovation and new technologies. And to do that, there's going to be a reshuffling and new opportunities for many countries to contribute to that in new ways. We're moving away from the security of energy being around the supply, the timely supply of oil and gas, to having the clean energy manufacturing and the supply chains in place to meet the transitions, whether that's renewables, hydrogen, or other. And this opportunity means a lot for Brazil and for other countries in Latin America as well as around the world. And I'm very happy to say more about that in the discussion, but I think I would leave it there for time. Thank you.
And I will come back to you to understand what are the big challenges or the biggest challenge for you, what you perceive looking at Latin America or the world, what are they? So with that, I'll go to Thales to understand a bit from the forum. What are the perspectives? How do you see this happening in Brazil and opportunities to bridge gaps between Europe or Brazil, and what can we do to interact and to make this more sustainable?
Rafaela, and I'm delighted to be here today, of course, with such esteemed speakers, and to also discuss such an important topic. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thales, the head of business engagement for Latin America at the World Economic Forum, which is an organization for public and private cooperation. And so the essence of what we do is to collaborate with multi-stakeholder communities to ultimately identify solutions for potential global challenges. And several new organizations here represented today, such as the IDB, EPE, as well as others, have collaborated with the forum over the past few years. And therefore, the views that I share today are, of course, echoing a lot of the contribution that comes from these multi-stakeholder communities that we have at the World Economic Forum. But to summarize the views and our position today with regards to Brazil's energy transition efforts is that we recognize it as uniquely positioned to become a global leader in that effort. Now, what does that mean? That means that it is, of course, a country that is rich in natural resources, as well as with a huge potential for renewable energy generation. However, we still see several challenges across the board that need to be addressed so that the country can benefit from this global movement towards net zero as we move towards 2050. And so to make sure that I keep things balanced, I'll share 5 challenges and 5 opportunities that we have identified through our work at the forum. I think the first and foremost point, and this is of course addressing something that's been mentioned, is that we are exceptionally positioned to benefit from climate action and the energy transition. But to do so, we need to address the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room for Brazil is, of course, to address greenhouse emissions that are primarily due to land use and agriculture. That is the biggest challenge Brazil faces today. And to legitimize our efforts in the global climate action, we need to ensure that we address greenhouse gas emissions derived from land use and agriculture. And I think that's something that's been mentioned, and I want to, of course, reinforce that comment. As a second opportunity, what we do see is that Brazil has vast renewable energy resources such as hydro, wind, biofuels, solar, so on and so forth, which is mentioned here several times. And Brazil can, of course, leverage several of these to position itself as a leader, potentially in exporting green and renewable energy, but to also address concerns related to hard-to-abate sectors. So sectors such as freight and transportation and aviation, which will of course be much harder to decarbonize compared to other parts of the economy. And so with Brazil's potential supply of biomass and biofuel, these are incredible opportunities the country can leverage over the medium and long term, and therefore benefit from the climate action that we see in the coming years. The third element that we see as a major opportunity, and this is something that's been discussed across the board over the recent past, is that because of Brazil's low carbon intensity, it is really well positioned to benefit from a global shift towards green value chains. And so what that means is that the country already has a competitive advantage, not a comparative advantage, but a competitive advantage in a green global value chain scenario. And so we really need to ensure that we maintain the energy matrix that we have today with the renewable resources, and that we ultimately legitimize our efforts and position ourselves to benefit from the green value chains efforts. The fourth element, which is critical and we see as an opportunity, is of course to improve energy and emissions efficiency in some sectors and industries in Brazil. And the fifth and last opportunity that we see as crucial is, of course, Brazil's role in fostering regional energy cooperation. Now we see enormous opportunity for the country to drive regional cooperation, especially with regards to energy infrastructure and renewable energy. We think about, of course, a global interconnected energy system, but really, if you think about it at a regional level, we are very far from being an integrated system. And so this is an opportunity the country can leverage. In terms of challenges, the central pillar of Brazil's climate efforts will depend on the social efforts. And so the social pillar is at the heart of Brazil's energy transition. What that means is that we need a people-centric approach to make sure that climate action is fairer and more efficient. For instance, as most of you will know, we face development challenges in isolated communities, as well as fossil fuel-based decentralized systems in northern parts of Brazil. And so we need to conceive a system that accounts for the more vulnerable parts of the population, and of course, invest in human capital and enhanced social protection, as well as development of labor that will benefit from the green transition, which has been highlighted in several reports in the past. The second challenge that we see as critical is, of course, Brazil's need to invest in infrastructure across the board, and that includes energy infrastructure. So we need to modernize our existing renewable energy infrastructure and to expand capacity given growing demand. And that is a critical challenge, because if you look at Brazil's infrastructure investment today, it is so low that it's unable to replace depreciated capital. And therefore, we really need to ramp up investment in infrastructure to make sure that we keep that energy profile and that we meet growing demand. The third challenge, which we see as important for the country, is to ensure that we have a stable and consistent institutional, legal, and regulatory environment. And that's something that Morgan mentioned early on. And I think that's a critical piece, because to ensure that we mobilize investments at scale for the green transition, we really need to provide an environment that is stable and consistent in terms of institutional, legal, and regulatory frameworks. And following up on that is the next challenge, which is to ultimately mobilize all the capital that is needed. And if you look at green investments in Brazil, it has increased. That is the trend. But if you compare, say, 2020, 2021 to 2022, there has been a fall. And there are several challenges behind that. And so we need to ensure that we create an environment that enables the private sector to move in and allocate capital at scale towards renewable energy. And the final and last element that I wanted to mention is the need for the country to have clearly identified sector pathways. And without clearly identified and accepted sector pathways, it will be very hard for different parts of the economy to transition, and for other parts of what is needed for the energy transition to thrive, such as carbon markets. Without a sector pathway clearly identified for each industry, those will be major challenges in our view. And so overall, we see immense opportunity for the country, and I think Brazil can, of course, greatly benefit from its existing green energy supplies, as well as, of course, the opportunities that it has with biofuel and biomass. We've mentioned regional integration as a great opportunity, but ultimately we need to address the challenges that we see in front of us. And of course, the study today really helped us solidify some of those understandings.
Thank you so much. It was like music to my ears, because I think that we are converging in all our discussions and in the recommendations to the path and the things that are important to Brazil. And we still have to dig in and then go to the second level and the third level in terms of how do we make this happen, and what are the good conversations, taking into account that everybody has this purpose for Brazil and that this could be our future. How do we set the path forward, especially when we're looking to 2030, 2040, so the midst of this pathway. So thank you so much, Thales, and I will get back to you, especially on the social pillar and fostering regional cooperation. But then let's hear a bit from Jeremy and how Institute of America is receiving an American perspective of the challenges for Brazil and partnering with Brazil, and what are the things that you're receiving. Thank you, Jeremy.
No, thank you, Rafaela, and to CEBRI. The Institute of the Americas is pleased to continue our collaboration with CEBRI. We have an event together at the end of June 27th, 28th in Rio de Janeiro, which will absolutely continue to consider many of these topics we've already talked about. And of course, my dear old friend, Decio Done. In fact, let me start with sort of paraphrasing and something Decio and I probably have talked about, or at least traded several WhatsApps about. And this is sort of what I would say is the orienting part of where the Institute of the Americas looks at these issues. And that's simply put, more energy and less carbon. And I think the bottom line is, how do we, as society and those of us working in particularly the energy sector, ensure more accessible and economic energy supplies, but less carbon, right? I mean, this is the fundamental challenge of balancing energy security and climate action. And so from that, at the Institute this year, what we continue to talk about, and we use this framing question of, well, what is the opportunity for Latin America in this so-called new industrial revolution? And I think if we look at a couple of these pieces, and I'll quickly share because I know we don't have much time, but two of the most relevant and I think worth noting come right to Brazil, and I think can be very much at the core of our conversation. We've already talked a lot about one of them, which is advanced biofuels, or what I want to prefer to call sustainable aviation and marine or maritime fuels. But the other, and I don't think we've talked enough about it, and I think Brazil has a role, is critical minerals. And I think the role of critical minerals, the energy transition requires an enormous amount, and will continue to require an enormous amount of critical minerals. Obviously, a lot of focus on lithium, but there's a whole host of other minerals that we don't have time to get into specifying. But if we look at our colleague Brent from the IEA and the wonderful work they did with their 2050 net zero pathway, just some of those numbers point to something on the order of demand roughly quadrupling, right? And I think if we look at any of the other scenarios, we see a world where there's an enormous opportunity, but similarly enormous challenge to balance demand and supply for these critical minerals to indeed produce that energy transition and the net zero pathway to get us to this goal of net zero by 2050, and that whole idea of more energy and less carbon, right? But also, I think that this can be a role that Brazil plays that maybe doesn't get the sufficient attention, because you hear about the lithium triangle and you hear so much about lithium in Chile and Argentina and even Bolivia. But I think if we want to put on the table this opportunity for Brazil and the opportunity for Latin America and the energy transition, in particularly from the supply side, let's be sure to include critical minerals. Back to sustainable aviation and marine fuels, I think we've heard a lot about that. Dr. Sklo emphasized some of the aviation pathway or aviation fuel and marine fuel, alternative fuel pathways. There's obviously an enormous leverage point for Brazil to take its 30, 40-year experience with biofuels and with the ability to really develop major supply and production of alternative fuels. So I think the goal to take us to another level as a world, but particularly as a region and Brazil as a country, is to really supplant so much of that jet fuel that's now coming from hydrocarbon sources with these sustainable sources that Brazil has a whole host of feedstocks. Again, not enough time to get into the variety of feedstocks. But then also, if we look at in terms of marine fuels and some of the big focus on ammonia, green ammonia, hydrogen products or hydrogen derivatives, and you see again, opportunity, right? You see these numbers and how much of the fuel space needs to be replaced or displaced by alternative fuels. Right now, I think there's a very small percentage of jet fuel is actually sustainable aviation fuel, and even less so in the marine space. So just to summarize, an enormous opportunity. Brazil can leverage its experience. Latin America as a region can really play an important part in this more energy supplies, more accessible energy supplies, more economic and low carbon energy sources. They really do ensure this pathway to net zero and this 2050 timeline is not just a mathematical model, such as Dr. Sklo mentioned, but really something that policymakers and investors and industry and us as society can attain. So again, thank you to CEBRI for your partnership with the Institute of the Americas, Decio, Rafaela, Leia. We greatly look forward to seeing you in Rio on June 27th and 28th for our joint event. Sorry to rush through those points so quickly, but I know we want to still have some conversation. So back to you, Rafaela.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. No, you brought added some important information. We do have a lot to contribute as well in critical minerals and innovation. But what is clear to me, and this is very convergent with what we have been doing here in CEBRI, is the importance of setting the right paths and bringing this all together in terms of what do we have to do in the midst of this path to make this happen. And if it's done correctly, there's a lot that can happen, and even helping other countries in terms of leveraging and bringing clean solutions for a sustainable world. So after hearing everybody, I'll go back to Brent with, there's a lot of investments that have been held back. We have been hearing like interest rates going up, unclear policy frameworks and market designs which are not so clear, weak grid infrastructure, financially strained utilities, high cost of capital. When you look to Brazil or looking at Latin America, what would you say, like, these are the bigger challenges? How could, what do you perceive, and what would you rank as, if this happens in Brazil, then I think we will have like a path to walk here and to have a prosperous path towards net zero.
Yeah, thank you, Rafael. Excellent question, and also my congratulations to other speakers on the points raised. I couldn't agree more. I mean, in this challenge, I mean, I think as you said, the financing and the scale of investment is really very challenging. This is true in Brazil, this is true around the world. So this is a very common challenge that we need to not only shift from investing in fossil fuels to clean energy, we also need to increase the total. And that's not so easy. So we need to go from something less than $3 trillion today per year, what we've been investing, to at least 4 trillion plus by 2030. And so given the current environment and inflation around the world, true in Latin America, rising interest rates, this is a real challenge, and it puts more emphasis, I think, on policymakers and governments to set very clear plans, to set the rules of the game and the frameworks for investment, that these are very clear that private sector investment can come in and help deliver the transitions that we need. And that means having this clear pathway that we're talking about. So clearly making that commitment, understanding what the pieces of the puzzle are along the way, so the milestones along the way, and sort of the rules of the game for each of the sectors and the technologies. I think one of the key signals there is we can put the investment forward, but we also need to make sure the innovation is happening fast enough this decade to help clear the path beyond 2030, which is not so easy. I think this is also one of the main challenges, is we not only have to deploy what we have and what we know now, but we need to clear the way and develop those technologies for the way forward beyond that. Now, each sector gets into very particular policies and guidelines, but overall it's about reducing risk for that investment and making it clear that these are investable projects, expanding the pipeline of those investable projects, and having an understanding and just a design of how it all fits together. I think this is sort of our overarching thoughts on how to move forward on net zero transitions. Again, Brazil is in many ways well ahead of the curve, and so has opportunities to both contribute to global transitions by example, but also contributing on these other fronts, on the technology side, on critical minerals, and those opportunities that will be essential for other countries around the world to move forward. So that power sector transition is one challenge that for many other countries will be one of the hardest and biggest parts of the transition. But for Brazil, my congratulations, Brazil has long been in that position. So I think that's a big strategic advantage, as was mentioned.
Thank you, Brent. And that will bring me to Thales. You mentioned two pillars, which for me, they are very close to my heart, which is the social pillar and also leveraging cooperation in a regional level, which has been always a challenge for Brazil, a cultural challenge, in many ways a challenge. And how does the forum looking for Latin American and how and investing in Latin American and bringing something that's meaningful? How is the forum observing these two points that you mentioned?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think the first element on the social pillar, Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions are largely derived from social issues. If you think about, for instance, land use derived greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation is driven, of course, by the lack of prosperity in certain parts of Brazil, and therefore, if we don't address the social issue, then our ability to ultimately transition to net zero will be void, and we'll be unable to achieve it. On regional integration, I think there's always been an interest. I know that the Inter-American Development Bank, which is here, Morgan, I know that's a priority for them, but it's also a priority for several countries. And the reason is that we have several sources of renewable energy available across the region, but because the systems are not integrated, we are not able to balance it out and ultimately leverage all this renewable energy that is available. And people are talking about green hydrogen, so on and so forth, but we could take a step back and think about, for instance, integrated energy systems that are a lot more efficient and ultimately will allow for economic development and social integration.
Thank you, Thales. Yeah, and bringing it all together. And one challenge that we have and we want to foster is bringing different sectors together to talk. So if this is something that we do know that for Brazil, it is important to bring the better use, like the land that we have with sustainable agriculture, integrated agricultural and forestry systems. How do we blend this conversation together with the minerals, together with infrastructure, together with the energy sector, so that it really can happen in Brazil? Jeremy, you mentioned the critical minerals and the opportunities in Brazil. Would you like to explore a bit more of this?
Well, I think it's something that we have obvious sources of minerals, but then, whether Brazil can begin to play in the space of lithium is a question. It's a little bit different profile. Perhaps some would argue a better profile than the brine-based lithiums from the Chile, Bolivia geographies, Argentina. So the spodumene, sort of the hard rock, some of these. And there are companies, Sigma is one that comes to mind that's gaining a lot of international attention, a lot of investment. So I think when you look at the size, if we come back to this, more energy, less carbon, the size of the pie, so to speak, is going to be what grows enormously. So I think it's a matter of how do you, as Brazil, and how do countries leverage, whether it's a lithium, whether it's other mineral opportunity, to be part of that larger pie, right? And to really make sure all of these things we've talked about, whether it comes to policy pathways, whether it comes to sort of certainty around regulatory and investment frameworks. So I think those things underscore, but you do have also at the end of the day, the resource profile. And I think that's there in Brazil for minerals, and whether it's leverage or not, whether the price point, whether the technologies can all be harnessed to be meeting part of that IEA quadrupling in demand for critical minerals, and that piece of it, obviously, of lithium. And then you get into, perhaps, and this is not a good way to end this, but you get into perhaps a conversation that's hugely important in Brazil around the electric mobility versus continued use of biofuels for mobility and transport. So, but no, I think that the type of opportunity, particularly in lithium for Brazil, needs to be further understood, and like you say, bring a host of investors, policymakers, and international players such as the IDB and such as IRENA and IEA to be part of this conversation, because this is cooperation. The only way we're going to attain this net zero goal and target is by major cooperation across an enormous amount of stakeholders the world over.
That's a perfect way to end, because this is a hot topic in Brazil, like the electrons versus the green energy for vehicles.
Sure.
And there's a lot to be discussed, even if there is only one path of that, or if they can compete. And I know that Giovanni really believes on let them compete, and let's see what's cost effective for Brazil. So with that, before going to you, Giovanni, I'll just go to Morgan, to looking at IDB, Morgan, and how you're seeing further developments here in Latin America. Could you bring some light of what IDB is perceiving in terms of Brazil's transition, and how are investments flowing, and what are you seeing for our transition?
Sure. Thanks so much, Rafaela. I think, I'd like to congratulate all the panel members. It's really interesting discussion. With regard to what we're seeing, I see there's just truly an explosion of interest, right, across the board. We have an event on green hydrogen coming up next week in Rio. We have the event mentioned by Jeremy. But that's just sort of indicative of what's happening on the private sector side. There is a truly sort of a groundswell of interest in different projects that we see going forward in the Northeast, but in São Paulo, across the board, across the country. So I think that the momentum is there. The recognition that there's huge potential, and there's a great opportunity here is very much present in the market, and we've been tapped on our private sector side to look at certain projects to provide some guarantees and or other financial instruments to try to bring some of those projects to fruition. From the other side of that is the work led by EPE and by the ministry itself. See, there's a lot of sort of really careful thought to how to think about the regulatory framework and to be proactive in attracting that. And so we're engaged both on that side, on specific on regulatory issues, and from a perspective of the private sector to try to promote more and better investment in different projects, but also very much on the private sector side. And so to not to go on too long, but I think that the overall impression we have is interest and sort of inertia, and we're very pleased to see that, and we're very eager to be an active participant both on the financing and also on to support the different players on the regulatory side to think through what are the specific challenges and how to address them.
Thank you. And now, Giovanni, I know that everybody spoke a lot, and it goes towards the policy frameworks, the market designs, and what has to happen, what kind of stability is the world looking for in order to provide these investments and make this happen for Brazil. So back to you for your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Rafaela. Well, I think the first thing, and we are very vocal in this project to explore the uncertainties, is to recognize that there is no one size fits all for energy transition. So countries, industries, business in general, and families has different income levels, financial capabilities, technological capabilities to deal with the energy transition and the decarbonization. So we have to provide a wide portfolio of alternatives to fit in each different pockets. So if we are serious about net zero in 2050, we have to address this reality to provide solutions that are cost effective and that delivers competitiveness. Otherwise, we will not reach the target. Also, all the panelists mentioned how well positioned Brazil is, and of course we do agree with that. And I would like to reinforce and to call the attention that we are reinforcing the commitments to energy transition in Brazil and to decarbonization. So I try to not to be exhaustive, but in any way, we have strengthening through the Renova Bio, the Gás para Empregar. It's a play on words that means like gas to use and gas to create jobs. The power sector modernization with modernization of hydropower plants, transmission lines, distributed generation, energy storage, and opening and space and opportunity to all kinds of innovations that will reinforce the energy transition in Brazil, including energy distributed resources, including energy efficiency, demand response, residuals and sewage program, the biogas program, the nuclear redesign framework and policy include SMRs, the fuels for the future to deal with advanced biofuels like sustainable aviation fuels, biobunkers, and biomethane, and also low carbon hydrogen. The National Hydrogen Program focused on low carbon hydrogen, including renewables and green. If you prefer, our approach is agnostic and focused on carbon intensity of the hydrogen, offshore wind framework, downstream Brazil to provide, to promote the investments in biorefineries and in energy complex. This is for the reduction of carbon emissions in the energy sectors. Also, as mentioned, we are dealing with the critical minerals framework to provide a better business environment for that. But also we have establishing a strong focus on carbon removal. So forest offsets, CCUS, BECCS, and we are discussing again the carbon, the regulated carbon market in Brazil, so we can provide the economic signs for the economy. And finally, last but not least, it's brand new. Yesterday, it was released in the official gazettes, the decree 11,547 decree that deals with the establishment of the technical committee for low carbon industry. So it will put together stakeholders from the public and the private sectors to establish roadmaps for different segments of the industry. So things are going on. There's a lot of things to do. Of course, we are well positioned as a country, but we are reinforce all the advantage we have, and we will repurpose assets. We will establish new assets so we can pass from existing competitive advantage to new competitive advantage in the energy transition and decarbonization pathways to 2050. So I return to you, Rafaela. I hope I have addressed all the issues desired. And finally, but not least, I would like to thank my team in EPE who has worked hard in this project. So I thank all the team in the name of Gustavo Nassif and Camila. Thank you.
Actually, you have to desire that they have a lot of strength to continue doing things, because there's a lot to be done. Nassif, Camila, Morgan, Sklo, and everybody who's here to bringing this together. There's a lot of things that we have to bend together. And the biggest challenge probably is bridging these gaps, is getting everybody to talk and to create this path. So there's a lot to be done, Giovanni. So, but definitely your team is incredible, as well as Carlos, Echeverria, and all the team that has been supporting Morgan as well, and Roberto Sklo and Sklo that are dear to us. But Sklo, I would finally, before ending, it's important to hear from the academia, because Synergia, which is, I'm a big fan, has been doing some incredible work, especially with the agency as well, and trying to bring together the use of land, the use of water, and what is cost efficient for Brazil. And I would like to hear your final words in terms of, from an academia perspective, what are the big challenges facing Brazil? If there's one thing that you could define, or some things that must be pushed forward, what would they be?
there are a lot of challenges, and I can add something here. Actually, it's like a learner hydra of learner, because when you cut a head, you find two other heads, and then this is a kind of exponential situation. When we had a more large carbon budget, we could face a more smoothly transition. But for such high ambition, then we need to speed up the transition and to have more investment, but also to deal with something that is quite new. We have to deal with, for example, water balance. We are talking about green hydrogen, so we need to understand where to produce the hydrogen with lower cost and to deal with water balance. Actually, Brazil has a good situation, but also Brazil faced the problem related to the climate change, because most of the Brazilian production, industrial activity related to the food production, most of the Brazilian energy system is not so resilient to the climate change. So this is an important thing to do in the case of Brazil. Brazil can have some mitigation options being implemented, but also given the change of the climate in the world, the global climate change, something can change in the case of the Brazilian energy system and food production and in the land cover as well. We are studying this, and this is a very, very difficult, let's say, mathematical understanding of what can happen in the series of hydro, in the series of food productivity, bioenergy productivity. And what I can say about that is that we do need to anticipate some adaptations options and to understand what mitigation options and adaptation options can be used together. For example, you told us about integrated systems. These are something that we should understand. The production, the combined production of food, energy, and materials in a piece of land, and how to do that, adapting for the case of the climate change, because Brazil is already suffering about the changing of the climate. So I think this is a major issue for Brazil, and Brazil faces this more than other countries that have the energy matrix, the energy systems relying on fossil fuels. Actually, this is a major challenge for the Brazilian energy system.
Thank you, Sklo. I've heard so much. I've done lots of notes here because definitely the discussion doesn't end here. We will do lots of others, especially in the second phase that we will go through even in 2023, 24, in discussing these paths and bringing this lively conversation in terms of sustainable agriculture, integrated systems. How does this go? How does climate impact that? And how could we move forward? Deforestation, bringing the social pillar, mentioning here all the innovation that has to happen, and how can we be useful for other countries as well, besides ourselves, in terms of bridging gaps and bringing the energy transition that everybody needs. So thank you very much, Thales, Bren, Décio, Jeremy, Giovanni, Morgan, Sklo, and all of those that are listening to us and have also participated intensely in this program, and Leia, which is here in the back side, on the background, but she's helping a lot, and Julia, and all the people that are here with us. So thank you very much, and hope discussing with everybody soon. Thank you. Have a great evening.
See you in Rio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Take care.